the chaos, the blood, the death, children on the floor, some of them gasping, taking their last breath, some of them with brain out, some of them with bowels out.
Welcome to The Tea, where we not only tell the stories behind the story, but bring you exclusive interviews with extraordinary individuals making a difference in our world. I'm your host, Myriam François. Today, we have a very special guest joining us for his first appearance since returning from Gaza just days ago. Dr. Mohammed Tahir is a British-Iraqi orthopedic and peripheral nerve surgeon who recently completed his third medical mission to Gaza, spanning an incredible 7 months. His dedication to providing critical care in one of the world's most challenging conflict zones and during a televised genocide has captured global attention. Dr. Tahir's experiences on the front lines offers a rare and invaluable perspective on the situation in Gaza. From performing hundreds of surgeries to witnessing the devastating impact of war on civilians, his story is one of bearing witness to horrors and of an unwavering commitment to saving lives. Today, we have the privilege of hearing directly from Dr. Tahir about his experiences, the challenges he faced, and on his thoughts on the ongoing crisis. Dr. Mohammed Tahir, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
If I may, how are you doing?
It's a good question. I feel that I've been ripped away from my purpose by coming back. Being in Gaza, although it was very difficult, and we saw tragedy after tragedy, and the most horrific scenes, I was in and amongst people who I would consider the best of us. And I felt that in being in Gaza, I was really on the front line between what is good and what is evil. Except, contrary to what they said in the beginning, we were the ones representing goodness because we were fighting for life and justice and equality. And all those things that they claim that they stand for, and yet now the facade has fallen and the truth has been unveiled. And so being ripped away from that land, although I walked from there after, of course, the ceasefire and after the March of Great Return, I feel that I should be there. And so I'm longing for that land and I'm longing for those people. And I'm sad as well. I'm sad because of what I see in the international media, I see from our international leaders. I'm disappointed.
Well, speaking of international leaders, we're speaking today on the same day that Trump has made the announcement that essentially America is now taking over Gaza and proposed plans to expel, or in other words, ethnically cleanse the population of Gaza into, Jordan and Egypt. And I should say, of course, that Jordan has, both countries have refuted that proposal. But this was something that those of us who have been watching the conflict and the occupation for decades predicted very early on. It was very clear that this was part of the wider ethnic cleansing of Palestinian land by the occupying forces. I want to ask you whether that announcement came as a shock to you and whether you think it will come as a surprise to people in Gaza, given all the talk of, Trump facilitating the ceasefire. There was a whole lot of people who were sort of, trying to convince me just a few weeks ago that Trump was our hope in the region.
When I was in Gaza, the day definitely came where it felt like, and certainly speaking on behalf of the people of Gaza here, they were drowning and they were gasping for breath. They were trying to keep afloat because of the number of casualties that had kept coming through the door in our hospitals and the destruction in and around us. And they had had enough. They were just saying, enough, just leave us alone. Just leave us alone, just let us be. It's a clear memory of mine. And so when the ceasefire came, people just wanted to believe that this was the end. And then when they saw that it was permitted for us to return to the north, and of course I walked with the people of Gaza to the north, there was an element of hope. And although when they got to the north and they saw the sheer and scale of destruction that was there, you know, you'd find it difficult to think or believe how hope can be inspired. But despite that, there was still hope for the future. When you hear announcements like those made today, they're trying to kill hope. And extinguishing hope in man is really a devastating emotional blow. But as I've said before, I've looked into the eyes of the people of Gaza. You will not conquer them. No matter how you try, whichever way you try to cook this process of removing them from their land. And it's taken many shapes and forms, of course. And the US had Joe Biden doing its bidding for the first half, and now you have Trump doing the second in a different way. But ultimately, they've used different strategies for the same purpose, and that is to remove the people of Palestine from their land. But they will not succeed.
And before we go into some of your personal experiences being in Gaza, can I ask you about what made you want to go to Gaza? It was obviously somewhere where a lot of people feel like they want to help, but, you know, what was it that made you, you know, leave your life behind here in London and go to Gaza repeatedly? And let's be honest, risk your life in so doing.
In fact, I was in Brazil at the time. I was trying to become the best nerve surgeon in the world, and it was on my plan. It was in the process. I was trying to follow in the footsteps of one of my mentors, Professor Jaime Bertelli in Brazil, who was considered the best nerve surgeon in the world. But despite the fact that I was in Brazil, and of course you can imagine being in a beautiful land with very friendly people, I could just never enjoy life, like many of us. The scenes we witnessed on our phones left us, you know, unable to sleep, unable to eat, in tears all day. I think it was the first time I'd ever seen children massacred, and it actually shown on social media in such a scale. It was the first of its kind. No one had ever seen that before. I don't remember, and I've asked many people. Nobody can tell me that they've ever seen so many children, or even in fact any children for that matter, you know, publicly displayed on social media platforms where they've been massacred or disemboweled or dismembered or crushed. And I just could not take it anymore. And I said to myself, if not me, then who? I have skills. I'm very well trained now. I'm very versatile as a surgeon. It felt like almost everything in my life had pushed me to that moment, and I said, I have to go. And as for risking my life, well, that fear only started to set in a week or so before the actual departure date. And I started to question. I started to think, well, look, life is good. Why do you want to go and die? There are doctors there anyway. Are you really going to change anything? All of these doubts started to creep up. And what I did was I turned to my faith. I turned to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I did istikhara, which is when you try to seek some kind of guidance from our scripture. And I came across a verse in the Quran that was just so powerful to me, and it was, why do you, when you, and it goes, I'm paraphrasing of course, or believers, why when you are called to, you know, follow in the footsteps of the way of Allah, that you cling firmly to this earth. Do you not know that the hereafter is so much greater? And that was almost like, wow, subhanallah. I felt like wind in my sails. I felt like I had some kind of just conviction that I didn't have before, and I felt fine. I will go, and what will be, and if that means that I die in the process, so be it. I'm prepared, I'm happy, I'm prepared for sacrifice. And this is a very important topic, and that's sacrifice. I went to Gaza prepared to sacrifice everything. And I gave my all, and I really tried to help as many people as I could. But despite everything that we did, it really at the end, it was futile. We stopped nothing. We didn't stop the war. We didn't stop all the slaughter, but at least we tried. At least we tried. And that is something that if every single one of us did, if we all genuinely tried and we were all prepared to make a sacrifice, no matter what that is, then we would see the reversal of this unfortunate change that we witness in our world today. So that was the reason. I felt that I had to stop looking to others for the changes, and I had to look into myself. And then I went, and then the rest is, as you know.
To be the change that you wanted to see in the world, literally. Paint a picture for us and for our audience of what a day in the life in Gaza when you were there operating was like.
I worked across several hospitals. But the hospital I worked the most at was at Shuhada Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir al-Balah, which is in the center. Central zone south of the Netzarin crossing. It became the epicenter of mass casualty incidents.
Why was that?
Just because there was a lot of refugee camps nearby. And by the way, when we say refugee camp, historically these were refugee camps where people erected their tents, and slowly they developed into towns and cities in their own right. So mukhayyam or camp is not like a place where there are tents. These are established cities or towns in their own right, but historically they were as such. Like, for example, in Mawasi, if that were to develop in 10, 15 years' time, it might have been developed into its own city, because you could see that trajectory before your very eyes. If
Israel allows cement into Gaza,
exactly. So Al-Aqsa was next to Al-Nusayrat, for example, in those central zones. And by this time, Rafah has been destroyed. I mean, I attended the latter half of the war. Khan Yunis was already destroyed. Deir al-Balah was still intact, and the areas around it were still intact, and the majority of the population was now displaced into the central zone.
Yeah, and Rafah, which we should remind ourselves, was designated as a red line by the US government and others early on in the assault. So you're saying that Rafah is completely destroyed?
Well, when I first started my missions at the end of April last year, I entered via Rafah. We were one of the very last missions to enter via Rafah. Yeah. And at that point, Rafah was, a red line, so to speak. Of course, when we entered via Rafah, each one of us was able to take as much aid as we wanted, because it was an Egyptian-Palestinian border. Mm-hmm. So we were allowed to take in aid. Of course, there was still Israeli intelligence. Yes. But, there were no restrictions on aid at that point. We all took 10 suitcases in. Mm-hmm.
But you needed still Israeli approval to cross that border.
Of course, you still needed Israeli approval. And there was still a huge limitation in aid convoys and trucks. I'm just talking about our possessions. Yeah. Egypt didn't put a restriction on the number of suitcases. So we all just filled our suitcases with aid.
So Rafah, the red line.
So when we entered Rafah was still standing. In fact, our team was split in two. Half of our team was based in the safe house in the city of Rafah, and half of us were based in the hospital, the European Gaza hospital, where we stayed night and day, because that's where we needed to be as surgeons to be able to respond immediately to mass casualty incidents and so on. And also because I just operated into the night virtually every single day. Yeah.
So a day in the life for you is you start operating early in the morning?
So generally speaking, I'll take the average day of Al-Aqsa, which is where I spent most of my time. Yeah. I would wake up. I would literally brush my teeth. I'd have a coffee, and I'd go to the OR. And what we were trying to do was trying to deal with emergencies and all those patients injured from before at the same time. So I'd start, I have a semi-elective list of patients with injuries that need to be dealt with, but they've not just come through the door. Because otherwise this backlog, and there are hundreds of thousands of these, will just be completely neglected. And that is kind of what was happening and is still happening.
And what are the consequences of that? So obviously...
Permanent injury, permanent disability, amputations waiting to happen, or deterioration in health such that it will eventually lead to death, and so on. You need to address those injuries. So we had a list where we would plan that list. So we'd go and we'd just start get going with our list. Let's say now we've started our first case, 9 a.m. or thereabouts. And then, for example, we hear there's a mass casualty incident. So we stop, we run to the ER, and we help in the mass casualty incident. And here it's just, indescribable. The chaos, the blood, the death, children on the floor, some of them gasping, taking their last breath, some of them with brain out, some of them with bowels out, some of them posturing in such a way because they've got such a severe brain injury.
None of us can imagine what you have seen over the last 7 months. Hearing it is difficult, let alone what you must have seen. So feel free to take a second, honestly.
Children with bullet injuries to the brain. At one point, I had 4 or 5 on the floor, dying, making the choice between who dies and who doesn't, because we have limited ventilators. Child coming in who is about to arrest, and you cannot do CPR because you cannot afford to give 4 or 5 people to one patient in a mass casualty incident. And so the ER doctor says, no CPR in a mass casualty incident. You just have to let that child die. It was horrific. And so we spent our time there, and we would go back, and then there'd be emergency surgery. So, you'd have a patient bleeding out, for example. Those were the ones that you needed to do life-saving surgery for. And so we'd jump in those operations. And of course, we're talking about like the Palestinian doctors as well, and nurses and anesthesiologists and, all of them in full swing and full effect, everyone throwing every last bit of energy at them, all the ORs occupied, trying to do our best for absolutely everybody. And then the mass casualty incident will, and also when one hospital might receive all these incidents, what they will do is they try to disperse some of the injured to other neighboring hospitals as well, what was left of hospitals, just to share the load, because no single institution could cope. And so then we'd finish, like the wave of the mass casualty incident would die down. And those that have died, and those that we've saved have been saved. And then you have problems of critical patients, for example, not having anywhere to go because there's no ICU capacity. So they'd occupy an OR. And then, oftentimes they would just slowly deteriorate and then die, despite all of that effort to try to save them.
And tell us why that is, because these are patients who in other circumstances with fairly basic medication could be saved. Is that correct?
Not necessarily fairly basic medication, but just, when you're offering a healthcare system is based on the fundamentals of, having equipment, having medication, having personnel, a clean environment, a safe environment. When you have a breakdown in any one of those, then the system starts to become defunct. If you have a breakdown in all of them, then I don't know what was keeping the hospitals alive, except for the good faith and the will of the people.
And throughout this, the Israelis are saying that they're allowing aid in, of course. So the limitations on the trucks, which the UN and virtually every single humanitarian organization said was not going in, the Israelis were saying was going in. Did you observe medical aid coming in that you were able to then make use of?
So the WHO would be the ones pushing to try to get aid in. There was also the Jordanians pushing to get aid in. And those were the two only sort of routes for aid to come in. And it was extremely stifled. It was never enough. I mean, I remember when we had heavy bleeding in patients and using a big piece of gauze called an abdominal swab or abdominal gauze, we had to wring it from blood to be able to reuse it. And there were many times where we didn't have drapes or gowns. We'd have to try to think outside the box about how to create sterile fields. We didn't have appropriate antibiotics. We didn't have diagnostics. There's not a single MRI scanner in the whole of Gaza left. It was destroyed. In the major trauma centers such as Shuhada al-Aqsa Hospital, there was not a functioning CT scanner. So these mass casualty incidents, you couldn't get appropriate diagnostics. There was equipment missing, and no analgesics. People came out of major surgery.
Analgesics meaning?
Pain-killing medications. People came out of major surgery screaming. The hallways sometimes would be like, honestly, it would be like just screams. I remember thinking and talking to my colleagues at the time, and I said, "Wow, this is it's like a horror show. Just the corridors, people screaming, waiting to have wound changes done." Because think about this, right? You have mass casualty incident. Some people survive. They have horrific injuries. I tell you,
Tell us.
I mean, the chunks of their bodies missing, limbs missing, and huge gashes in their body, and scars from head to toe. And you need to change the dressings on these patients. They get infected very quickly. So they were daily like 3. So in Al-Aqsa Hospital, we didn't have the main OR facility was due for renovation, and then the war started. So what they had was the sort of the obstetric area where there was 2 ORs for gynecology surgery and 3 delivery suites. Those all became ORs. There were major surgery happening in the delivery room, which is like a cubicle, no lighting. When it was in the summer, it was extremely hot, and you can't fit in any equipment. It was terrible, just a terrible place, terrible situation. And everyone tried. So oftentimes outside the mass casualty incident, those 3 cubicles in particular were for changes of dressings, just constant cycle, like hundreds of patients coming in, because you need to give them some kind of strong sedation. Often we had ketamine or propofol. And so they would do a mixture of those and allow dressing changes to be performed. But you cannot afford to give each patient really the time that they need, because it would clog up the whole entire day, and you have hundreds of patients waiting. So you're just dabbing on wounds really. And by the end of the day, that corridor used to smell so badly because of the air of infection. And I often used to say, man, someone that didn't have an infection, if came in, they would definitely take one on the way out. It was just a horrific situation, really. And don't forget, when you have to do daily change of dressings for some of these patients, and you have to give them ketamine, their tolerance increases, and now you're creating like a different problem of a dependency.
Right.
For so many patients. I mean, there are just so many layers to this that many people haven't even considered or can think of because they haven't experienced it. When you go there and you see it and you live it, and I spent 7 months there, and my last mission was 4 months. By the end of the time that I was there, this was the words of the Gazans. I was one of them. I was fully embedded in the healthcare system, and I lived like them. And it was an honor for me, by the way, of course. But I really got to see and live and experience what the war meant to so many people.
How did your 3rd trip compare to your first trip? Because I'm assuming that you're seeing a massive deterioration of the healthcare system, but also presumably of the wider population and their ability to find, medical support, food, shelter, clean water throughout that period. So give us a little comparative, if you could, between the two. I mean, how was the third mission when you got there? Were you surprised at anything compared to when you'd gone in the first time, when presumably it was already horrific enough?
So what I should say, just as a precursor to that, is that I missed the first half of the war. And talking to many of my colleagues, and this really should be the focus of a documentary and an investigation into these two sieges of Al-Shifa.
So Al-Shifa hospital, we should say, was one of the hospitals targeted by the Israelis. And you're talking about the two sieges of that particular hospital, which the Israelis claimed was because that there was some sort of a network operating underneath the hospital, which...
Yeah, of course, never proven. There was never any tunnels. And you remember the graphic where there was this tunnel system under Al-Shifa hospital and the main headquarters. It was all nonsense. It was never proved and never demonstrated.
Yeah.
But I walked in Al-Shifa hospital. I saw it. When I went in my second mission, when I went to the north of Gaza, which was, of course, for me, something I had to do. I had to get to the north because the north was the most desolate, the most deprived, the most desperate, the most in danger.
And I'm guessing there was not a queue of people desperate to go to the hospitals in the north.
And it was much more difficult to get to the north as well, more dangerous. There was no safe zones and so on. But I had to get to the north. And when I got to the north on my second mission, and I'll come to your question in a minute, but just to give you the precursor, I think it's important. And I walked the halls of Al-Shifa. I was just gobsmacked. I was in shock. The hospital was destroyed. It had the original building, they had the ER, completely laid to waste. And I went to the Specialties Hospital, which was a relatively new building, like 3-4 years old, the pride of the medical system in Gaza, by the way, if not all of Palestine. And one of the largest hospitals in the whole of the Middle East. It accounted for 40% of all medical output in the whole of the Gaza Strip. It was destroyed. The stairwell was detonated. The buildings were burned. The grounds were laid to waste. There were hospitals turned on ambulances turned on its side. There was a mass grave outside. And then when you got speaking to the guys that worked in Al-Shifa, who are now, a lot of them displaced in Al-Aqsa, you thought to yourself, wow. I mean, and the things that happened in Al-Shifa were just beyond what you could fathom. You're talking about multiple people in the same OR having surgeries. You're talking about people having dressing changes in the corridors without any analgesia. You're talking about people dying and being left to rot for 2-3 days before being allowed to be buried in the courtyard. And the Israelis would get some of the staff to be like, right, you guys, you're going to go pick up the corpses and you're going to bury them outside. Just because, for whatever kind of humanity that was left. The siege of Shifa and what happened in Shifa was just something that needs to be investigated, needs to be documented. That's the first thing I'd say.
You yourself saw mass graves
at
Al-Shifa hospital.
Oh.
Describe what you saw.
I was in the building of the specialties hospital. We looked outside. Of course, there were no windows, nothing left. I appeared over a destroyed wall. You could see just many hospital beds that were burned and thrown over the edge. And in the distance, you could just see a huge space that was turned to just sand. And that was the place where many people had been buried. And the staff were telling us how they're trying to now relocate many of these bodies and offer these individuals a dignified burial in a graveyard somewhere else. And that's not the first time I saw a graveyard in a hospital, by the way. I saw it in
a mass grave.
Mass grave. I saw it in Nasser as well during my first mission.
You saw mass graves outside at least two hospitals.
Yeah. When I visited the Nasser hospital, it was still recovering because it was still laid to waste at that time. Khan Yunis was still destroyed and uninhabited. Of course, Khan Yunis later became inhabited despite its destruction, and life tried to restart there.
Yeah.
And Nasser did restart again, and they tried to redevelop some of its services, but some of the buildings have been destroyed, and you could see when you walked there, it was defunct at this point. You could see the graffiti on the walls and the writings and the emblems that they had left behind, their legacy, and so the Israeli soldiers, that is.
What kind of stuff?
It was like little graffiti. You'd see Star of David. You'd see little, sort of etchings of in Hebrew of certain. I didn't understand, and then there were symbols. I didn't know what the symbols meant. I don't know. They were like their sort of logistical markings and so on. But you could tell that an Israeli force had been here. So in Al-Nasser as well, we saw a graveyard, and we saw remains of human in the field, and we saw the body bags in the fields of Al-Nasser, and we saw upturned ambulances in the fields of Al-Nasser Hospital. I think I saw 2 or 3 ambulances upturned, and I visited. Yeah. So I definitely saw that. So this all happened in the first half of the war that I was not witness to. Yeah. It's important to say that because huge untold amounts of suffering happened then too. Yeah. In terms of the latter half, when I first entered the European hospital, I walked in, it was not a hospital, it was a refugee camp. There were just so many displaced people, presumably all the ones that used to live in Khan Yunis, because it was still uninhabited at this time. And even along the stairwells, the people would just put up a sheet and they live in that along the stairwell. And I remember very clearly every time I used to come out the OR and walk to my room, I'd see one man that used to sleep in a certain position and his feet would stick out and he'd be sleeping kneeling because there's no space. And there were children that would be on the floor. And I tried to, it was just so much suffering. I'd taken lollipops with me in great quantity, and I would see some of these children lying on the floor, and I would just put a lollipop next to their head, and I just hope maybe that will make them smile in the morning. Maybe that will ease some of their suffering, because they don't know. They've been dragged into this, and there's no fault, and yet everything has been destroyed around them. So when I first got in, the European hospital was as such, but Rafah was still, and it's not this quite attacked, it was starting to get attacked. And when I left, I had a very heavy heart because I was only there for 2.5 weeks or so. And of course, the Rafah border was closed and we had to exit through a delayed process via Kerem Shalom or Kerem Abu Salim. And I just had the huge amount of regret that I had ever left people in need. And when I just started to witness the mass casualty incidents and the huge need for medical support and teams and aid and so on. So that was my first experience. I was just starting to experience, the incidents and the mass casualties. By the time I'm in mission, you asked mission 3. I'm no longer a peripheral nerve surgeon. I'm a war surgeon now. And I deal with vascular, plastics, orthopedics, nerve. I deal with lots of injuries, huge wounds. That
are beyond what your specialization is.
Beyond, yes.
But which you are the most equipped to deal with of the specialists on the ground.
Yeah. Particularly in the north.
Yes. Sorry, and it should be said that there are some exceptional Palestinian doctors, right? I don't know if you want to give a shout out to any of your colleagues that you were working with, because sometimes there might be the impression that the Western doctors are going out there, and helping these poor Palestinians. But of course, many of your colleagues are world renowned, and many of the people that were targeted and killed were world renowned surgeons. So I was wondering if you could maybe say a word about them.
So to give you to make you understand the point I was making, in the north of Gaza, there were, for example, I think only 2 vascular surgeons. These guys were in demand, and only so many places they could be at once. And so if I'm in an OR, and in the other OR there's somebody bleeding out, I have experience dealing with vessels, so it's not a completely new specialty to me. Yeah. But I'm the one that's going to come and help them. That's not to say I'm better than the guys that are there. No, of course not. It's just to say sometimes I was the only one there. And in fact, I worked with many vascular surgeons there, and they trained me. They trained me. And they recognized, okay, this guy, we need to get him to a standard because he might be the only person there. So they are the ones who trained me in vascular surgery. And there are many heroes in Gaza: surgeons, nurses, anesthesiologists, anesthetic technicians, the porters, the security, the recovery nurses, the people on the wards. I am telling you, there are many unsung heroes there.
I'm sure.
There is one vascular surgeon in the south who is just on call 24/7, going from hospital to hospital to hospital to hospital in an ambulance, so that he doesn't. So they move him around in an ambulance in the hope that he doesn't get targeted, particularly at night.
So tell us about that. So was there a sense among medical professionals that they were being targeted in the way that I've heard from journalists firsthand, that, you know, their family members, for example, didn't want them sleeping at the family home? Friends asked them, please don't come around because we believe that you are going to get us all killed because you're being targeted. Was that something you found amongst medical professionals as well?
Of course. And especially because oftentimes mass casualty incidents used to happen in the evenings or towards Fajr time.
Okay. Which is morning dawn prayer.
Morning dawn time. And in order to move around at night, it is extremely dangerous. So as a blanket way, anyone moving around risks their lives. So if a surgeon's coming at the middle of the night to the hospital, they're risking their life.
Yeah.
Even in an ambulance. But that's the safest way possible.
Yeah.
So they would be doing this on a daily and just saying, this is what I must do for my people. Honestly, the surgeons there, I take my hat off to them. They are really phenomenal surgeons. But they've had to deal with so much, and it's, you go in saying, okay, I'm coming to help and so on. Okay, let's see how you hold on like that for 6 months. Missions, people who came on missions oftentimes be here for 2 weeks or 1 month at most. That was the maximum. Very rarely did people stay beyond that. But there are some.
Yeah.
There are some that stayed and did long durations. But my point is, oftentimes people from outside used to come and criticize, but they don't have, you haven't been tested. Your endurance hasn't been tested. You haven't had to work in the difficult conditions. You haven't had enough time to experience the losses that break your heart and leave an imprint on you and hurt you and continue to affect you. You haven't had that. Also, to add to that, as the Gazan surgeons, they also have to look after their families. They have to worry about where they live and where they sleep and the displacement and being able to feed. These are all other variables you're not considering.
They're living through a genocide in addition to treating the victims of the ongoing genocide. The Tea is a fully independent, non-partisan production. No corporate ties here, just a small, dedicated team working hard to bring you honest, impactful conversations. If you believe in our work, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button now and join us on Patreon. You'll find the link in our bio. I studied Arabic in college, and it is truly one of the most beautiful, poetic and rich languages. If you've been waiting for your opportunity to learn it too, then check out Lingua Verna. Lingua Verna offers flexible, large group instruction, high quality recorded sessions, and my favorite feature, live group conversations with native Arabic speakers. It's a fun but essential way to build your language skills. Lingua Verna makes learning Arabic fast, fun, and affordable. Check out the link below for a special 10% discount on an upcoming course. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned criticism from the outside. Obviously, we saw that, a huge amount of amputees, right, coming out of Gaza. There was some criticism online about whether those amputations were necessary. I'm not a doctor. I'm not in a position. I think there's a lot of emotion going around. Can you help people understand how those decisions were being made and why they were being made?
Firstly, I have not come across those online, so I'm disappointed that there are people making those statements. The sons and daughters of Gaza don't wish to amputate the limbs of their children. and particularly any more than anybody on the outside. So that's a very strange criticism to be made. There are many variables and many factors involved in the amputation process. And I'm aware that there is a statistic of approximately 4,500 child amputees now in Gaza. I've had to amputate limbs of children, and it's one of the most difficult things. It really is. It's just so hard, but you have to switch off your heart and become very tough and get on and do it. When you have you're dealing with injuries that are related to shrapnel and sometimes huge pieces of shrapnel. And these pieces of shrapnel, which of course are indiscriminate, and of course you're going to cause child injuries when you bomb schools, which happened, I remember when I was in my third mission in the north, where I spent nearly 6 weeks. We had a series of days where schools were being hit day after day after day, and we were just getting injuries. So these pieces of shrapnel, which can come from a fighter jet, can come from a tank, can come from a quadcopter dropping an explosive device, let alone all the injuries that you can acquire from gunshots, from sniper, from fire rounds of live ammunition, from a quadcopter that has a gun like an M6 attached to it onto a quadcopter and fires at people. They really excelled in the ways to kill. These destroy human flesh. I came across a video of a tank that was fired at individuals in Khan Yunis, I think, or Rafah, and the guy recording it just missed the tank fire by a millisecond, but the actual round that leaves and zooms literally past him is so ferocious that imagine what that would do to human flesh when it encounters it. It destroys it. So you're talking about mangled limbs. Oftentimes you're talking about mangled limbs. There are some incidents which are beyond repair. You cannot reconstruct. If it's completely destroyed, what is there to put together? And so you have to amputate. And so there are those patients. Then there are those which, for example, might have, it's like questionable. The first thing to say is that the gunpowder and the residue on these pieces of shrapnel are highly sources of infection. Like they create tissue necrosis and so death of tissues, and can cause really severe infections that can potentially kill a patient.
Yeah.
And even when you, for example, reconstruct and you give a chance, and I've done this, so there are times where I've tried to save a limb.
Yes, there's a story online of you, a recorded story of your operation. Was it Mariam, the young girl, Mariam, whose arm...
So we can talk about Mariam in a second.
Yeah.
Because she's slightly different. But in this, so like in generally speaking, so for example, say the vessel is severed, the main artery is severed, and the tissue is all destroyed, but you try to reconstruct. A vessel will not survive. It will break down. It will rupture, and it will bleed on the ward, and people can die from that. And also, if the surrounding tissue next to a blood vessel is not clean and infection-free, it will also cause that. And so what the surgeons realized, and the other thing is, is these patients need daily, a lot of wound care and a lot of management, and it's very labor-intensive.
Yeah.
When you're in the middle of war, you just don't have time for that. And so some of these surgeons picked up a lot of experience because they tried at the beginning and they realized a lot of limbs were being amputated and patients' lives were being put at risk. Yeah. That they were saying, okay, we have to save the life. This I know is going to head into this direction. We should amputate. So And they did it because they put the patient's best interests at heart.
Of course.
That's all it was.
The story of Mariam is an example of you trying to save a child's limb in this context of war and the complications that arose in that circumstance. So can you tell us the story of little Mariam and let us know if you have an update on her?
This was in the time just before there was talks of ceasefire, but there was heavy shelling and heavy airstrikes, and we were getting lots of mass casualty incidents, and it became, we were looking at each other and the guys were saying, man, it's like the beginning of the war again. It was a very difficult time. I heard about a girl that had a missing arm in the ER, and I said, okay, let's go and assess her. So I ran to the ER and I found this sweet, innocent child sat on a chair, on a trolley, in the resuscitation room, writhing around in pain because she had severe abdominal pain and a missing left arm. I said to the father, where is the arm? And he said, the arm is still at the home where the airstrike happened. I said, okay, is there any way of retrieving the arm? And he was a bit shocked. And I said, no, I'm serious. Is there a way of retrieving the arm? And he said, okay. He looked at one of his relatives and he said, can you guys try and fetch the arm? And so they said, okay, we'll go. And this is in the middle of the night, very dangerous time, in an area that was already attacked. They risked their lives. They went to the house. In the meantime, I said, let's get the child to the OR and let's just be ready. At worst, we'll just, manage the wound.
How old is little Mariam?
9. They then raced along, and then they brought the arm in a black dustbin bag, and I took the arm out and I put it on the table, one of the operating tables, and I quickly inspected it, and I looked for the vessels, and I looked for the nerves, I looked at the bone, and the arm was kept cool because it was nighttime and cold. And I said, okay, now actually we can attempt a replant.
Yeah.
So we said, let's go ahead and do that. In the meantime, the general surgeons then figured out that actually this abdominal pain was a lot more severe than they first anticipated, having examined her under anesthesia, and the shrapnel entry site, which was in her buttock, had actually gone all the way across and destroyed all her pelvic organs.
Oh my God.
So they were compelled to do a laparotomy to open her abdomen and operate. And so whilst I was operating, they were operating at the same time. This type of surgery, a replant of an arm, was never done in Palestine before. It was the first of its kind. And at first, we succeeded. And it was, even by day 4 or 5, the arm was just a miracle. The color of the hand was the same color as the other hand, like there was no signs of any problems. But I was always worried because, as I've said before, now we're coming into the infection phase, where vessels start to break down, where we start to get necrosis, where we start to have problems. And we started to experience those. And we had to do revisions to some of the veins. And that's when the local vascular surgeons, I got them on board now to help me to, really optimize her management. But you're dealing in a system which is just broken. We give, for any type of vascular surgery that needs, like a vessel repaired, you need to give blood thinners, heparin in this case. She was one of the very unfortunate patients where heparin wipes out your platelets.
Oh, this is a rare condition,
This is a rare reaction. So platelets, and the other thing to say is that we don't have any way of monitoring the degree of anticoagulation or blood thinning medication. We don't have those blood tests available. The laboratory does not do those. We don't have the testing equipment. So we're kind of coagulating patients blindly, or anticoagulating them blindly rather. And she developed this reaction where she started bleeding from everywhere, from her abdominal wounds, from her where the cannulas were in, and all of a sudden she became very unwell, and we were very concerned that she actually might die. So we had to stop all the heparin, and we had to give her blood pressure boosting medications, which narrow vessels, and so it's kind of like the combination of the two is the worst you can imagine for the reattached arm. And in that time, I'd also had the help of one of a British plastic surgeon who was there on a mission as well to cover the wounds. He'd come and help me do a flap and so on. So we really had tried, but at this point now, she was bleeding from everywhere. We reversed it. We managed to save her. And I said, despite the hit, there was a bit of an insult to the hand, but the rest of the limb was okay.
Yeah.
And so, okay. And we were now, 2 weeks plus into the injury, and the arm was still there. And we had slaved over this arm, I tell you. And this is what I mean about the amount of effort it takes to save a limb is huge, particularly when you're dealing with those injuries, because it's not like a cut. This is like a blunt force which just rips through tissue and pulls, doesn't cut, some pulls, and it causes injuries on the inside of the vessels and so on. The abdominal problem was not solved. And I can't go into detail to protect her privacy.
Of course.
But she had major issues going on here. Major issues that were still unresolved. We had to transfer her to another hospital because they had pediatric surgeons that could cope and deal with this. And unfortunately, she bled in the night from her arm. She developed complications. And in the morning, they went to see her, and the arm had basically taken its last insult, and it died, the arm. So they were compelled to then amputate the arm, which was so devastating for my team and I, who were based in the first hospital.
And for her, no doubt, because she probably had hoped.
Of course. I'm going to come to the pain in her and her father and her mother. The father was always so grateful, and the mother was always so grateful. And Mariam also was so grateful that we'd really embarked on this journey to save her limb. But in the end, they really, despite everything that we did, they realized that we were just in the wrong place. And we were trying to evacuate, but there was just no way. It was impossible. And it's still, Mariam is still in Gaza, and we still cannot get her out right now until this day.
And she needs emergency evacuation.
She needs, because she's still got, the arm problem is now, she's been amputated, but she's still got these major abdominal injuries and pelvic injuries. And her father, we speak to each other daily. He sends me updates. And, she might need to have another operation today for her abdomen. Poor girl, she's suffering. She's really suffering. And she used to be just like a normal 9-year-old girl. She used to love doing social media recordings of herself, dancing, singing. And she had, I think it was a cat that she used to play with all the time. And it's very heartbreaking to see her lose her arm like that. We were all so sad, because we really tried to give her that future. And she became a focus of hope.
Yes.
In Gaza.
Yeah. And I think externally, I'm sure when you're in Gaza, you don't realize it. But obviously for us also on the outside watching you guys doing what you can, we also hold on to those moments of hope. Because we know that they're important wins for morale. Yeah. That they're important for the children to remember that there are people trying to help, and that there are people that pull through. And I think that those blows are devastating on so many levels. You mentioned the need for her to evacuate. Can you tell us a little bit about evacuations? Because we know that there are so many people, not least hundreds, if not thousands of children that desperately need medical evacuations. What is the status of medical evacuations for, seriously injured children at the moment?
So I understand that there are around 14,000 patients who need to be evacuated. These are the most critical. I would argue more because there's a broken healthcare system. So unless you're able to have a parallel system where you rebuild the healthcare and are able to treat, whilst evacuating the most needed, that number is actually much greater. Part of the ceasefire negotiations was the stipulation that patients, the most needy, would be evacuated from Rafah.
Yeah.
I think the number was around 50 per day. The Israelis are falling short on that agreement. Patients are still stuck in Gaza. One of my other patients, Hiba, and I will tell you about her injuries. This is beyond tragic. She will lose her arm probably in these days because she could not be evacuated either in time. It seems to be an ineffective process, 50 per day. My other concern is when they go into Egypt, where do they go? Where do they stay? And then there's the process. There's another stagnation process before they then move to other countries. It's just such a complex scenario. But there are thousands of people in need, and particularly children. That's those with direct consequences of war. And then you're talking about other children and adolescents and people, for that matter, with cancer. I know a medical student that has an aggressive cancer that we could not treat there because we didn't have chemotherapy. We didn't have an MRI to make a proper diagnosis. So what happens to her? There's just so many people. Hiba, I'll tell you about Hiba.
Yeah.
Hiba is 12 years old. She was the victim of an airstrike which caused a huge injury to her arm, where it basically destroyed the nerves and also cut the major artery to the right arm, which left it paralyzed. They did major vascular surgery at the time to reattach the vessels to keep that arm alive. She had a fracture to her left arm and a nerve injury on the left arm as well. So she's got partial nerve injury to the hand, but some function, very little. She has shrapnel injury to the thoracic vertebra, where it caused complete paralysis of both her legs. Oh. She had a fracture to her left leg, which was open. And not that was not enough for anyone to go through. She's now, as a result of being bedbound and malnutrition, severely underweight, and she has pressure sores everywhere. Oh my God. Her sacrum, her heels, her elbows, everywhere. And when we attempted to try to get the right arm working again, she had problems in healing. And so the wounds just broke down, and her vessels started to get exposed, and she developed complications. And she nearly died. I had to do CPR on her in the OR to save her. And then we didn't have a choice between her arm and her at that point. She became so unwell that we had to tie off the vessel in her arm because I ripped over the cover to see her, and I saw this girl that I'd become and that I've started to know very well, just like slumped in a position. I thought, my God, she's we can't let her die. No way.
Oh my God.
Please, Ya Allah. So we did CPR and she came back, but then we decided she was not in a fit state to pursue any surgery for her arm anymore. So we tied off her major vessel to her arm, and it's probably been amputated. That all happened because we could not get her out.
Evacuate her.
Yeah.
And she's
also one of our patients that needs to be evacuated.
Yeah.
There are many. I mean, each one of them has a story.
Of course.
The 8-month-old whose leg I tried to salvage and I couldn't, and I had to amputate, whose mother died, and I operated on her mother. Moments before I operated on her, her mother died before us. And her father and her other brother had died at the scene of the airstrike. And she had shrapnel injuries all over, and she had injuries all over her face and her neck. She had a laceration from this side to the other side. Almost as if someone had slaughtered her. It's just, the suffering is just so deep and so huge, and it takes all forms of life. You know, we're just touching on some aspects, we're touching on some stories. There are thousands of people like this, each with a story, each with a tale, each with pain, each with suffering.
And those are the wounded, because there's also the wider issue of starvation that you were dealing with, right? I mean, you and your team, everyone is operating, working these really long hours, but there's also starvation set in Gaza throughout this period as well. What was it like day to day, just even trying to provide for your, daily nutritional needs to be able to function? Where was food coming from? How were people coping?
So it came in waves. It wasn't a one constant situation throughout the whole time I was there. There were times where things were relatively good. There was fruit and veg in the markets, very expensive, beyond the means of the average person.
Yeah.
But
where was that fruit and veg coming from?
From traders.
Yeah, who are getting it where?
From Israel. Traders from Israel importing them to sell them.
Right.
Not aid.
Right. So Israeli companies making money off selling back food to starving people is what you're saying?
Correct. And also to give the appearance that, oh, look, there's fruit and veg in the markets. But
yes, I saw some propaganda videos actually doing exactly that. Look, these markets are full of food, but of course never stating that nobody could afford it.
Yeah, exactly. Like a pound of tomatoes, I think was $50. I remember one time I was buying some fruit as a gift, and a woman with a child, her child was asking for a mango, and this poor woman asked the vendor, how much it cost, and just wasn't something she could afford, so that she just took the child and kept walking. And I ran after her, of course, and I gave her. But I witnessed it firsthand, how it was beyond the reach of the average person. I mean, we used to talk to our colleagues about how much weight they'd all lost during the war.
Yeah.
Many of the colleagues when I'd feel them, it's the ribs, very prominent ribs everywhere.
Yeah.
And it became like they just made humor out of it. Like, I lost this much and I lost this much.
Yeah.
I experienced it.
Yes.
Particularly when I used to go to the north, what we would eat is just canned food items.
Mm.
Those were from food for the locals. It would be food aid, but these are the things that we sold in the markets as well. So we just buy them from the markets.
Yeah.
And we lost a huge amount of weight because, in the north in particular, there was no fruit, there was no veg, there was no meat, there was nothing. Things, of course, improved at the very end of the war when the ceasefire came through and then aid started to come in, and then the markets started to flood in, and then people had chicken all of a sudden.
Yeah.
But also there was a flour crisis. There was a flour crisis in the south where there was no flour.
Yeah.
Fajr managed to get in like thousands of sacks of flour, which we distributed to the people.
Yeah.
In the north, they had the flour crisis where they would tell me, man, we used to eat the grain for animals. We cooked that, and that's what we had to eat at one point. I'm telling you, there were periods of this war which there was immense suffering. I didn't witness firsthand because it happened in the first half.
Yeah.
So it was like a wave. There were times where it seemed okay and the times where it seemed particularly difficult.
Yeah.
I experienced some of those particularly difficult times and some of the good times.
I'm guessing one of the more positive memories you may have had was of an image that I think is etched into the public imagination now forever, which is the Palestinians walking back north to their homes, a scene which many people thought would never happen. And you made that perilous journey with them. And it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit about what that journey looked like, felt like, smelt like, was, what are you seeing? What is all around you? And how are people feeling on this march of return, which of course culminates in them returning to an area that has been completely devastated?
That day was really, I think when I remember it, I think of terms like epic, biblical, just really historic, such meaning. It was a day that we never thought would happen, but by the grace of God, we were suddenly, got the green light and people were marching. And I wanted to be one of the people. I wanted to live with them that experience. I felt that, the Gazans accepted me as one of them. And so I had to walk with them too. And particularly my friends, Anas, Hamza and Hamada, who are my team members in Gaza, they wanted to walk to their home in Bet Hanoun, the most northern part of Gaza, which is only meters away from the Israeli border. So we set out on a journey. And of course, there's hope. There's joy. People are coming back to their homes. I think also there's a lot of fear, worry, anxiety, what's facing us, what's awaiting us. We walked along and I could see injured people. I could see obviously everyone in rags and their clothes are all muddied and dirty. And, these are mainly people that were living in the Mawasi, were displaced in tents and camps. And they were pushing what little possessions they had, primarily like mattresses and duvet sort of covers. It's like the majority of what they own, right? And whatever clothing they had. And there's the person that's pushing their father or their mother on a wheelchair. There's the mother that's dragging 4 or 5 children, toddlers with them. There's this, there's that. There's a person who's carrying his father on his shoulders. There's persons pushing carts with all their possessions on them. And this is like on a earth, sandy, a floor, and all of a sudden, then it turns into an obstacle course. It's like there's a big mound. So you're in a place where you're trying to help people overcome this mound. Imagine trying to push your father on a wheelchair, or drag your children over that. It turns into there's a lot of watered down areas which are wet. Now there's a sludge. People pushing wheels through that became immensely difficult. There was a trench with bridges people were trying to cross. What the hell is this? I've driven on that road before when I was in the WHO UN convoy going from South. It wasn't like that before. This was created so that nobody drives along that route. But you didn't need to do that. No one was taking a car there. And there was one tractor that tried to come to level the floor for the people, and it was hit with an airstrike, and the person that was riding it was killed. So despite that, it took us about 6 hours to walk to get to the city of Gaza.
Yeah.
At that point for us, one of our friends was waiting in a car. And then we went to the Baptist hospital where we met our friends, some of the doctors. And then the following morning, we met some of our colleagues in the public aid hospital.
Yeah.
And then we set on the journey to Bet Hanoun. And then we got to Bet Hanoun, and it was my friends Anas and Hamza and Hamada. And we were in their family home area, and it was turned to dust, completely leveled. We stood on the ruins of Anas's former home. Anas is a very dignified man, and they managed to sort of get some food for us, and they laid out the table, and it was us and his father. And I'd never seen Anas be upset. Of course upset, but never seen him cry. And I looked, I could just tell he was hurt because he was very quiet. And we were eating, and I looked up, and he was wearing a baseball cap, and I could just see tears coming down his face. And I leaned over, and I just put my hand on his knee, and I said to him, "We will rebuild it." I knew how hurt he was, and this was the thing that I was witnessing, was the pain now. Having made all this journey, the pain and the realization of having your future and your home and all of that destroyed, your memories. Where will you put your children? Where will you put your wife? Where will you get clean water from? Where will you source food from for the average person? So many questions.
Yeah.
It was very difficult. And then we visited the Indonesian hospital very quickly because I have a memory there. Yeah. And I saw it was also attacked. And I met the local doctors there, and I gave them thanks, and I told them, "You are the heroes." Yeah. If it wasn't for you, the North would have been lost forever. And then we went to Jabalia. And in all the time, all the shocks that I'd experienced in Gaza, Jabalia not only shocked me, it shocked the people of Gaza too. Anas and Hamza and Hamad, we were all like, wow, it was destroyed.
And this was because prior to that, Jabalia was, thriving, big tower blocks, I guess you could say, home to, thousands of people. And so you come upon it and it's completely flattened.
It's as if serial nuclear bombs were dropped on this area. When I worked in public aid hospital, I would go to the ceiling, to the rooftop. Bear in mind, the rooftop, the top 2 or 3 floors of the public aid hospital were bombed out.
Yeah.
As well, so you're walking in rubble, and I would look into the distance in the night time, and I would see Jabalia from afar, and I would just hear the thuds, the loud explosions coming from Jabalia, and I always wondered if I would ever walk the streets of Jabalia and see Jabalia. Sometimes when we would be in the OR, the entire hospital would shake, and the guys would tell us, because they became aware of what was what, they would say, no, that's not an airstrike, that's building been detonated to level it. Because they used to go around with put explosives, set it up and destroy. And we'd hear those huge thunderous sounds. Sometimes we were, the ground would shake. It's like a mini earthquake. And walking in amongst Jabalia there, seeing that firsthand was shocking, absolutely shocking.
Can I ask you now, now that you're out, who do you blame? Where do you feel that, more could have been done, more should have been said? Who do the people that you are with in Gaza, hold responsible for their current situation, which is potentially now, in addition to the genocide, potentially being ethnically cleansed from their own land after all the horrors they've just endured? And of course, not to mention the rest of Palestine, because of course, the idea that there's a ceasefire only holds if you're only looking at Gaza, and even there it's questionable because there has still been some attacks, but the West Bank is now on fire. So actually the reality is that there is no ceasefire in Palestine. I think it's worth stating out loud, right? There is no ceasefire in Palestine, that the conflict has simply moved from the attacks on Gaza now to the West Bank. But just your final words to the world, what would you like to say to people who are watching? Who do you hold responsible? What could we have done, should we have done differently?
I think as a people, and I mean this with respect to the people from that land, for example, Arabs, we've always turned to the West, to the US to save us, hoping or praying or, just thinking that they were ever going to come and turn against Israel in defense of Palestinians. And that is the greatest delusion. The greatest delusion is that. We've seen the collapse of human rights and what war crimes represent and so on. And you've seen the double standards. We've lived it now for 15 months plus. We know they don't hold any value anymore. So us continually turning to that for the solution is just wrong on so many levels. The solution must come from inside. We've all been on our journeys as individuals. We found ourselves in difficult times. But then a moment must come in your life where you say to yourself, will I continue on this journey, or will I make positive changes? And I think that time has come for us as a people. Enough relying on someone who's never coming to help you. We must turn to ourselves. We must be unified. As Muslims, we're always bickering, looking at differences, not what unites us. Look, we all want to see a peaceful world where people live and are allowed to be successful and look after their families, and where nobody kills one another, nobody transgresses against another, nobody steals from another. This is the vision we all have, And that's what most humans have, in fact, of any denomination. But if I can address our Muslims, brothers and sisters, it is to say, if there was ever a time to be united, it is now. Palestine has always united us as a cause, and this must be our flag that we all rally behind to help our brothers and sisters in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in all the areas, and also expand it to Africa, where there are huge human rights violations in Sudan, in the Congo. We're now seeing problems happening near Rwanda as well now. So, this fight for righteousness is a universal one, and it begins with unity.
Dr. Mohammed Tahir, thank you so much for everything that you do. Thank you for your service. Thank you for sharing your reflections with us today. And of course, I want to thank everybody for watching. The suffering in Gaza is not just a headline, it's the daily reality for millions of people. Dr. Tahir's testimony reminds us that behind every statistic is a human life, a child, a mother, a family shattered by Israel's illegal occupation and war. If you want to support Palestinians, consider donating to a charity like Palestinian Medical Relief Society or Fajr Scientific, which is where Dr. Tahir works, or of course Al-Haq Europe, who promote Palestinian human rights through legal research, litigation, and advocacy. At the T, we believe stories matter. If you value independent journalism that amplifies voices from the front lines, please do support us. Subscribe, share this conversation, and consider joining us on Patreon, because the truth needs a platform, and together we can make sure it reaches the world. Stay informed, stay awake, and now and always, power to the people. Thank you.